Welcome to part 2 of Tuesday's lecture. What I'm going to do now is begin to look at the rise of what we're going to call the plantation complex, the incorporation of Africa, and with that continent, racially based slavery into the emerging capitalist world system. Before I move into the lecture, I again want to reference historiography. Much of what I'm going to be sketching in the time that remains is based on two important books, both candidates for review in History A04. The first one, written in 1964, is by Eric Williams, and it's called Capitalism and Slavery. It was one of the first pieces of historical literature to begin to see slavery not as a vestigial element of the feudal past, but as a dynamic, central part of emerging capitalism. I might also add here that in addition to being a brilliant intellectual, Williams was a politician as well. In fact, he was Prime Minister of Trinidad for a period. And speaking of historians who are also politicians, Walter Rodney was a leading politician in Guyana. And for our purposes, what's really important is his 1972 work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. One of the first pieces of scholarship to look at ideas of economic development and underdevelopment and show how the sort of poverty, malnutrition, low educational levels that the African continent has been plagued with are tied directly to its very unfortunate long-term encounter with European colonialism. And this book as well would be an excellent candidate for the book review assignment. In fact, over the last few years, when students have looked at both the Eric Williams and the Walter Rodney books, they both enjoyed reading them and have produced very, very insightful book reviews for our course. The rise of a plantation complex, that is large-scale, single-unit agriculture, producing commodities like these listed on the slide, using African slave labor, linked the New World to the emerging world system. Sugar was probably the first vitally important commodity, and we see this in the Caribbean and in South America, followed just by a few years by tobacco. So by the end of the 1500s, these two commodities were in great demand in Europe and were flowing backwards across the Atlantic in prodigious quantities. Beginning in the late 17th century and really taking off in the 18th, rice and indigo. These are the two crops that gave North American slavery its start. Some of the greatest fortunes along the coast of South Carolina and the very northern bit of Georgia around the city of Savannah produced some of the most remarkable fortunes because of the value of rice. Indigo, a vitally important dye in the early modern period, a blue dye. In fact, blue jeans originally were dyed with indigo, and this too was produced on the North American mainland. By the 18th century, coffee production, particularly in Brazil, has taken off, and beginning in the 1820s and 1830s, the rise of cotton as an exceedingly valuable and important commodity feeding the Industrial Revolution in the north of England. Cotton had begun to give the American South a brand new identity, and the cotton boom that ran through the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s set the American South on a collision course with the North that ultimately resulted in civil war. Now, the path to racial slavery was not at all direct, not at all certain. As we heard from Professor Pilcher's video blast, colonists, like the Spanish, first relied on forced native labor. Now, in many places, this wasn't possible. Much of the Caribbean, for instance, indigenous people quickly died out, victims of European disease. In other places, say the eastern coast of the United States, natives on home terrain retreated into the interior, moved away from European colonists. In those areas where it was not possible to force indigenous people to work for Europeans, a system of indentured servitude emerged. And even if we look at British colonies such as Barbados or Trinidad that later became infamous for their plantations based on African slave labor, we see the beginnings of production with indentured servants. These are Europeans, generally lower class folk, who, in exchange for a promise of freedom after 7, 8, 10 years of servitude, have their passage to the New World paid and are auctioned off. Only they're not auctioned off for life. They're auctioned off when they arrive for a limited period of time. And when their period of indenture ends, depending on the contract, depending on the location, they're given a new suit of clothes, they're given a bit of money, sometimes they're given land. I think a very important point to make about indentured servitude, certainly for the English, is it was seen as an alternative to slavery. As we'll see in a few moments, certainly slavery was well known. We see a much quicker move into racial slavery in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. But the English preferred not to rely upon a racially othered labor force, but preferred to put into indentured servitude lower class members of their own society, or societies that they had colonized in Europe. And the great example here is the English colonization of Ireland in the middle of the 17th century. And in fact, if we look at Britain's mainland colonies, as well as many of Britain's Caribbean colonies, in the later part of the 18th and the very beginning of the 19th century, we see many, many, many Irishmen serving as indentured servants. Racial slavery, as I've just suggested, comes a bit later, and as I mentioned just a moment ago, it moves in a very irregular way. But the important point that I want you to take away from this point in the lecture is that by the first decades of the 18th century, racially based plantation slavery is a dynamic force throughout the Americas. If Portugal and Spain are among the first countries, imperial powers, to begin to use African slaves as labor on their South American, Central American plantations, it's really the Dutch who perfect the transatlantic slave trade. And in fact, the Dutch West India Company, chartered in the middle of the 17th century, is designed explicitly to travel the African coast along the west side of Africa, capture, trade for, secure slaves, and transport those slaves, not just to Dutch colonies around the world. Many, as we saw several weeks ago in our class, are as far away as Batavia, current-day Indonesia, the Cape Colony, but also to transport slaves to the Caribbean. Britain, again, I would emphasize, a dynamic latecomer, gets into the act in 1660, also by chartering a company, the Royal Africa Company, with the same kind of remit as the Dutch West India Company, and also granted a monopoly by the Crown. Wherever African slaves replaced indentured servants or replaced enforced native labor, they became vitally important to emerging plantation economies. One historian, Robin Blackburn, whose book I mentioned at the beginning of part one of this lecture, went so far as to call slaves the shock troops of New World slavery. They were absolutely vital to the takeoff of production, far more important than in Spanish colonies. In most of the Brazilian colonies, African slaves made up as much as 50% of the population. So if we look at, say, Brazilian sugar, as opposed to 2% in Spanish America. It's important to pause for a moment and consider both the numbers and the dynamics of the transatlantic slave trade. A very conservative estimate is that 10.5 million Africans were transported against their will as slaves between 1500 and 1850. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a conservative estimate. Recently, some historians have looked carefully at the available data and have upwardly revised this figure to as high as 13 or even 14 million. Now, the total trade to Brazil was 5 million slaves. The total trade to the British West Indies, a further 3 million, and the total trade to the Dutch and Spanish Caribbean, a further 2 million. Now, if we pause here, this is a rather remarkable set of figures. The vast majority of African slaves transported from West Africa across the Atlantic wind up in Brazil and the Caribbean. Only a minuscule, relatively minuscule number, 300,000, arrive on the North American mainland. Now, how do we explain this and what is revealed by looking at these figures? For one thing, sugar production, whether in Brazil or the West Indies, was incredibly arduous. Combine this with a tropical climate, we see that sugar slavery in the Caribbean and South America was a death trap. Those areas had an almost insatiable demand for African slaves because mortality rates were so high, slaves were dying off and needed to be replaced. Similarly, fertility rates were very low, meaning that the slave populations in these areas did not reproduce themselves. North America is a very different situation. Here, after the very early colonial period, mortality rates drop, fertility rates rise. 300,000 slaves grow to become a population of around 11 million at the time of emancipation in 1865. It's a very, very interesting and I think important dynamic here. The demographics of the transatlantic slave trade. Here's a snapshot view of slavery in the Americas at the middle of the 18th century, circa 1850. So moving from top to bottom, we see slave societies taking hold on the American coast, from Virginia to Georgia, with tobacco being the main crop in Virginia and North Carolina, rice in South Carolina and Georgia. We then turn to the Caribbean basin, and you can see in dark black the key zones of slave-based development. Jamaica, Haiti, parts of Cuba, and also parts of what now we call the Bahamas. We look at the northern edge of South America. We see a number of slave areas, Dutch Suriname to the far east, what's now Venezuela, owned by the Spanish, and New Granada, also owned by the Spanish. And then if we drop down to the central part of South America, we have some Spanish slavery in what is now Peru, the area around Lima on the Pacific coast, in large areas of Brazilian Portuguese slavery on the west coast. Coffee production in Bahia and to the north, sugar production in the areas around Rio de Janeiro. A few further important points about the rise of the plantation complex and the ramping up of the transatlantic slave trade, particularly in the 18th century. First, there's an enormous impact on African society and economy. I alluded to this in part one of the lecture when I introduced the book by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I'm going to turn to my colleague Steve Rockel in a video blast to further elaborate upon this point. I'm here with my colleague Steve Rockel, who teaches African history here at UTSC. And Steve, I wanted to begin by asking you if you could comment on the impact of European colonization in general and the transatlantic slave trade in particular on African society and culture.
Well, of course, both colonialism and the slave trade have been central to the African experience since around the 1500s. The slave trade in particular, of course, was a massive diversion of resources, capital, technology, ideas and so on out of Africa to the New World, also to the Mediterranean region and across the Indian Ocean, because although the Atlantic slave trade is much better known, there were large-scale slave trades across the Sahara Desert and also across the Indian Ocean as well. So Africans have contributed massively to historical change since the 1500s into the 16th, 17th, 18th, up until our own era. In terms of capitalism, of course, Africans supplied some of the technologies and ideas for early plantation production in the Americas and the Caribbean. They also, of course, supplied most of the labor, and this was a forced labor under brutal conditions. But that labor and some of the cultural contributions and technological contributions that came out of Africa, such as, for example, the rice plantations in the southeast of the USA, couldn't have succeeded without African knowledge. So Africa's been central in a variety of ways, but of course African people have suffered through these processes greatly.
Steve, let me ask you a follow-up question. Could you spend a moment telling us about the involvement of Africans in the slave trade, and in particular, the impact that this had on West African society?
Okay, so let's deal with the first question. African involvement in the slave trade. Well, of course, it was big, and Africans, merchants, traders, states, warrior societies, and so on, were central to the production of slaves, producing captives that were then sold into the slave trade. This is a controversial issue, of course, and but if we think of it in a different way, it's really not so controversial. Africa was really the most diverse continent in the world in many ways, and there's no reason why Africans would see all other Africans as their allies, their neighbours, and so on. Europeans never did, so I don't think we should pretend that Africans were any different. They fought amongst themselves, they had conflicts, they had competitions over resources, over control of slave routes and trade routes and so on. So it's not surprising that Africans engaged in the slave trade when Europeans, of course, and other peoples around the world were also engaged in the slave trade. The second question about the impact, well, of course, there was a massive diversion of young people out of Africa, so in other words, the most productive, energetic people. There was a hit in terms of loss of population in some areas, but that shouldn't be exaggerated because populations did recover over time. But there was a loss of dynamism, there was an increase in violence associated with the slave trade, and that of course had a negative effect on economic development.
Slavery, of course, was not a new institution. It had existed throughout much of the ancient world. But what we're seeing from really the late 16th, 17th, into the crucial 18th century onwards is a new kind of slavery. Whereas in the past, slavery had involved servants attached to households, some kind of small-scale agricultural labor, artisanship. What's happening with the rise of the plantation complex is African slavery is race-based. In fact, it's not going so far as to suggest that race emerges as a modern concept because of the rise of plantation societies in the New World. In the past, slaves were not necessarily differentiated by the color of their skin or other physical features. But increasingly, in the New World, whether we're looking at British colonial North America, the Portuguese experience in Brazil, the Dutch in Suriname, bonded status means black skin. Black skin means slave origin. So the invention of race is a very, very important consequence of the rise of the slave trade. And I want you to think about, we'll be looking at this in the weeks ahead, the way in which the emergence of this form of inequality helped facilitate the rise and the spread of capitalist relations. I think it's also important to note that we're seeing here for the first time are the emergence of human beings as commodities, as important to this emerging world system as the barrels of sugar that are being traded back across the Atlantic. And I have a graphic here that I think makes this point in a very powerful way. No doubt some of you will have seen this graphic because it widely circulated in the 18th and early 19th centuries, actually as part of abolitionist material. And it continues to circulate. This is the slave ship Brooks, a British slave ship that plied the Atlantic. And what we're seeing here is the way in which slaves, human beings, are packed into the ship's hold for the awful middle passage across the Atlantic. Many would have died. All of these slaves would have lived in filth, in squalor, in absolute terror as they were transported for several weeks across the Atlantic Ocean. As human commodities, slaves were part of a trading system that we sometimes call triangular trade in the Atlantic. Now, triangular trade meant that from Europe to Africa, we see a flow of cloth, weapons, alcohol, metal, and manufactured goods that are traded on the coast for slaves. These slaves form a leg of the triangle that moves from Africa to the Americas. And the third leg of this triangular trade sees the agricultural products, the commodities produced on plantations, making their way back in a eastward direction across the Atlantic. So the slave-based commodities that I mentioned just a moment ago, sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, coffee, and cotton form the final leg of the triangle. And in this slide, you see the triangle graphically illustrated in what I admit is a very primitive map, but one that nevertheless makes the important point. This triangular system doesn't emerge overnight. And what we've done in the last little while is we moved extraordinarily rapidly from early European contact with native people in the Americas in the 16th century. Columbus in 1492, Hernando Cortez just a few years later, to what is a mature system at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. I do want to make one further point about the rise of this mature system. It would seem that almost all the elements of the financial apparatus that nowadays we associate with capitalism, banks, joint stock companies, brokerage houses, these come into being not only before economics as a profession emerges, but before the rise of factories, before the rise of wage labor itself. Now this brings us back to a point that I made early on and I want to emphasize now. It used to be that historians and others saw slavery as a vestige of the feudal past, something that was incompatible with emerging capitalism and was bound to fade away. I want to suggest the opposite is the case. That rather than being something vestigial, left over, this new form of slavery was actually central to the emergence of capitalism and played a crucial role in the dynamic takeoff of this Atlantic system, which in its mature form is illustrated by the triangular trade. A little later on in our course, we're going to be looking at the way in which unfree labor, not just slavery, but other forms of unfree labor, persist well into the 19th century, and how capitalism comes to rely not simply on free labor or wage labor, but comes to rely in crucial areas and arenas on unfree labor. Now, to wrap things up, let me return to the main argument that I suggested at the start of the lecture. What began as an effort to solve one of the crises of European feudalism, the need for royalty, and here it's particularly the Spanish monarchy, to secure wealth for consumption and war, had become, by the 18th century, a dynamic new phase in emerging capitalism. And one of the things that marks this new phase is the rise of a racially based plantation system, a system of slavery that linked different parts of the global economy together in entirely new ways, hence the triangular trade and the map that I just showed you. Built into this argument, in somewhat subtle form, is a periodization. We started by looking at Portugal and Spain, the first European powers to develop New World colonies. 2 points to make here. One, this is what I called crown capitalism. It did not emerge out of civil society. These weren't merchants. This was the monarchy using its military might. And although we do see slavery by the end of this period, what's far more important for the Spanish colonies is the use first of native labor and then only later the turn to slave labor. The Dutch play a crucial role in the middle part of our chronology. And if you're going to leave here remembering one thing about the Dutch, it's their entry into the African slave trade and the way they run with this and become the major slave trading power, providing, if you will, the oil or the grist for the economic engine that's ramping up in the New World. And then finally, in the third stage, we see latecomers, the French and the British. Let me now leave you with some weekly prompts. Why did some nations expand imperially earlier than others? What forces drove the search for overseas markets? And finally, in what ways was slavery central to the rise of capitalism? You're going to be able to review this video. You're going to be able to look at the slides that I'll put up on our Slack platform. So I think answering these prompts is going to be easier this week, perhaps, than it has been in past. Now, finally, let me say a little bit about the reading for next week. Now, next week we start a new unit. We're looking at classes and class formation. And we're actually going to read a selection from Karl Marx himself. This is actually a pamphlet that Marx and his lifelong collaborator, Friedrich Engels, wrote in 1848, Manifesto of the Communist Party, something that I'm sure many of you have heard about, but I suspect a few of you have read. We're pairing this with a very short and very readable chapter from Bruce Laurie's Artisans into Workers, Household to Factory, which looks at what we might think of as another stage in the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Some of this will go over material that we talked about a week ago. We're looking at shoemakers, and our reading was Alan Dolly's book on Lynn, but some of the other material that Laurie puts forward will be new. And I will see you next week in person in the usual time and the usual place. Thanks.